Imagine arriving on an alien world where the walls literally show your anxiety in glowing colors. That's exactly what happened to Ambassador David Reeves when he stepped onto Asteria, a planet where emotions are public display, and one wrong move could mean intergalactic war. His track record isn't great. Last time he accidentally declared war during a toast. Now Earth's future depends on him not screwing up again. The moment Reeves's boots touched Asterian soil, the welcoming archway flushed a deep, embarrassed orange. He could feel his own pulse hammering in his throat, and the archway pulsed right along with it. A slow, rhythmic thrum that broadcast his nervousness to anyone within 100 meters. His last diplomatic disaster, the toast that somehow became a declaration of war on Sigma Phi, played on a loop in his mind. The memory itself seemed to tint the air a deeper shade of unease. A slender Asterian in a flowing gray tunic approached, a barely there smile playing at the corners of their mouth. First time on Asteria? Zephyr's voice was dry, almost bored, but their eyes were sharply amused. They didn't wait for an answer. The architecture reads biosignatures, emotional feedback. Try not to think about your last posting. It was already too late. The path under his feet shimmered with a pattern that looked suspiciously like a shattered wine glass. Here, social cues weren't subtle. They were environmental. The walls didn't just reflect mood. They metabolized it, turning anxiety into visible light and panic into public spectacle. Every doubt, every flash of imposter syndrome rippled across the surfaces around him in real time. A thought about his inadequate language prep made a nearby bench flicker with mistranslated glyphs. A worry about his posture turned the floor momentarily slippery. It was like his internal monologue had been subtitled by a malfunctioning AI, awkward, literal, and painfully honest. This was more than personal humiliation. It was a political liability. On Asteria, a diplomat's control wasn't measured in carefully chosen words but in the steadiness of the light they cast. Reeves was broadcasting a full-spectrum disaster. He took a slow breath, trying to corral his racing thoughts. But the ceiling above him only swirled into a more complex pattern of orange and gray worry. Zephyr watched him, not with judgment, but with clinical interest. Your species. You hide this, yes? Internally. Fascinating. They gestured at the wall, which was currently displaying a childish stick figure drawing of Reeves falling into a pit. We find clarity prevents misunderstandings. Just as Reeves felt the situation was beyond salvage, something shifted. Instead of recoiling from his visible panic, a group of Asterian aides nearby began to nod, their own ambient glows softening into sympathetic pastels. His raw, unfiltered anxiety wasn't being read as weakness. It was being read as authenticity. The lack of guile was, for them, a sign of transparent intent. The panic that would have ended a negotiation on Earth was here, an unexpected icebreaker. The walls slowly began to calm, the orange fading to a warm, curious yellow. He hadn't mastered his emotions. The environment had simply adapted to them, building his flaws directly into the architecture of the moment. The corridors didn't just sit there. They moved. They breathed. Walls flowed like slow liquid, forming arches where none had been seconds before, sealing off side passages when Reeves even thought about taking a wrong turn. This wasn't architecture. It was a sentient navigation system that read intention better than he could express it. He tried to remember the route. Left at the crystalline junction, third opening past the resonance hall. But the palace seemed to rearrange itself each time he blinked. He took a hesitant step toward what looked like a main thoroughfare. The floor subtly inclined, tilting him toward the correct path instead. When he stubbornly turned back, a gentle, warm barrier pulsed against his shoulder. Not solid, but firm. Like a parent steering a child away from traffic. The correction felt almost polite. Almost on his collar, the translation butterflies, small biomechanical devices that looked like living jewelry, stirred. They usually only worked on language, but now one detached and fluttered near his ear. It emitted a soft chiming sound that somehow felt like a chuckle. They were adapting to his sense of humor or lack thereof, trying to lighten the mood he was radiating. Emotion here wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure. The walls didn't just display his feelings, they responded. His frustration at being herded made the corridor narrow slightly. His curiosity about a glowing mural caused it to brighten, revealing hidden details. The system operated in real time, a constant conversation between his inner state and his outer world. Every step deeper into the palace felt less like walking through a building and more like walking through someone's conscious mind. A very polite, very persistent mind. He noticed something else. The more confused he got, the simpler the path became. Obstacles retracted. Distractions dimmed. It wasn't punishing his disorientation. It was compensating for it. The system seemed almost amused by his human stumbling, patient in a way that felt both alien and deeply intelligent. When he finally stopped fighting and just walked, the hallway straightened into a clear, well-lit passage directly toward his destination. That's when it clicked. The palace wasn't testing him. It was learning him. Studying his patterns, his hesitations, his rhythms, it adapted not to challenge but to accommodate. Each adjustment was data collected, a profile built in real time. His confusion was a feature, not a bug. It gave the system more to work with. Back on Earth, smart cities boasted traffic sensors and energy grids. They called it adaptive infrastructure. Here the walls felt your doubt and made the way easier. The floor sensed your fatigue and became softer. Light bent around your mood. It made Earth's tech look like giving a caveman a stick and calling it urban planning. The chamber door wasn't a door. It was a seamless wall of swirling liquid crystal that hummed at a frequency Reeves could feel in his teeth. This was the emotional resonance lock, Asteria's idea of security. No keycards, no retinal scans, just the raw, unfiltered content of your soul. Zephyr stood beside him, their expression unreadable, but their posture suggesting this was the real test. Reeves straightened his jacket. He took a breath and focused. Diplomatic confidence. That's what he needed. The calm, assured presence of an Earth ambassador. He mixed it with what he hoped was genuine curiosity, the kind they'd appreciate. The door's surface pulsed, shifting through muted grays and a hesitant blue. It stayed shut. He tried again, pouring on more confidence, more polished professionalism. The gray deepened, the blue flickered and died. The lock remained sealed. It wasn't working. You are trying to perform the emotion, Zephyr said, their voice flat. It reads the performance, not the feeling. The lock detects dissonance. You are giving it a rehearsed speech when it asked for a conversation. They gestured at the inert surface. Stop performing. Just be appropriately curious. Asterian security didn't care about his credentials or his title. It measured psychological state. It wanted an authentic emotional signature, a specific blend of intent and openness that couldn't be faked. The door was a lie detector for the soul, and Reeves was failing spectacularly. He watched the colors on its surface, now a muddy, conflicted brown, and felt a fresh wave of frustration. That only made the brown darker. He closed his eyes. This was worse than any boardroom interrogation. He had to actually feel the right thing. He forced the diplomatic mask away, let the practiced smile drop. He stopped trying to be the perfect ambassador and just looked at the door. What was it made of? How did it work? Was it conscious or just programmed? His mind, always chasing problems, latched onto the mechanics. The mystery of it. The sheer weirdness. A genuine spark of interest flickered in his chest, unforced and real. The door responded instantly. The murky brown vanished, replaced by a clean, bright amber that swirled with threads of silver. It was working. He leaned in, his earlier anxiety forgotten, caught by the puzzle. How did it differentiate performed curiosity from real curiosity? The amber brightened, the silver threads multiplying, swirling faster. He wasn't thinking about Earth or his mission or his many failures. He was just interested. The door glowed, its hum rising to a pleasant, resonant chord. With a sound like cracking ice, a vertical seam appeared in the crystal, widening silently into a perfect archway. The inside of the chamber awaited, cool air whispering out. He looked at Zephyr, who gave a single, slow nod. Their usual dry amusement was gone, replaced by something that looked like approval. It does not keep threats out, they said, stepping through the new opening. It invites the right minds in. Their security didn't exclude. It selected for psychological compatibility. For a species that lived in emotional transparency, the most dangerous thing wasn't a weapon, it was a liar. The door had needed to know he wasn't one. The elevator doors didn't open so much as dissolve, vanishing into fine crystalline mist that carried the scent of ozone and cold stone. The sudden transition from enclosed space to vast openness hit Reeves like a physical blow. One moment he was in a quiet humming box, The next he stood at the edge of an amphitheater carved from a single colossal geode. The scale was staggering. Curved walls arced hundreds of feet overhead. Every surface a facet of polished crystal that caught and bent the light into impossible patterns. It wasn't just a room. It was a geological event. This wasn't an accident of design. The intimate, winding corridors had been a deliberate prelude, a gradual tightening of focus before this explosive reveal. The Asterians understood spectacle. They understood how to make a visitor feel small before the conversation even began. Reeves took an involuntary step forward, his boots clicking on the polished floor. The sound didn't echo. It was absorbed, measured, and then reflected back as a soft musical tone from the ceiling far above. The room was listening. Arrayed in tiered seating that seemed to grow naturally from the crystal were the council members. Each sat on a throne that was less a chair and more an extension of their own nervous system. Their emotional states weren't just visible. They were broadcast. One elder's seat pulsed with a calm, deep indigo of focused thought. Another flickered with anxious yellow sparks. A third glowed with a steady green that felt like patient judgment. There were no hidden expressions, no diplomatic masks. Every feeling was on display, amplified by the crystal structures around them until the very air hummed with their collective mood. This chamber wasn't built for discussion. It was built for emotional resonance. The crystal acted as a conductor and amplifier, refracting subtle feelings into glaringly obvious signals. A ripple of doubt from one council member would spread through the latticework of the ceiling, tinting the light for everyone. It was a system designed to make private thought a public resource. There was no hiding here. No room for the careful lies and strategic omissions that defined politics on Earth. Reeves felt a fresh wave of his own anxiety, a cold knot in his stomach. The crystals embedded in the floor around his feet responded instantly, glowing a soft, apologetic blue. His unease was now part of the room's decor, a little island of human nerves in a sea of alien composure. He tried to steady his breathing, to project the calm he didn't feel, but the crystals just turned a deeper, more troubled shade. The system was ruthlessly honest. It celebrated transparency and punished performance. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of intense formality and crushing intimacy. It had the hushed, serious tone of a high-stakes negotiation, but it felt like standing in someone's living room during a family argument where everyone was saying exactly what they meant. Every shift in mood, every flicker of impatience or spark of interest was shared property. It made Earth's diplomatic chambers, with their soundproof walls and private whispering, seem like theaters for mutual deception. He finally understood. This unbearable honesty wasn't a personality quirk of the Asterians. It was their protocol. Their entire system of governance was built on this forced transparency. In a room where a concealed agenda would make the walls scream crimson and your chair vibrate with discord, the only viable strategy was radical honesty. Lying here wouldn't just be rude. It would be like trying to have a private conversation in the middle of a symphony. Impossible, disruptive, and painfully obvious to everyone present. There was no announcement, no fanfare, no ceremonial procession. One moment the council thrones were occupied by elders radiating their various states of focus. The next she was just there, standing at the center of the amphitheater floor as if she'd always been part of the crystalline structure. Princess Eleonora hadn't entered. She had simply manifested, her arrival as understated as it was absolute. She wore a simple gray-lined tunic, not robes of state. Her hair was pulled back in a severe practical twist. This was not a royal making an appearance. This was a specialist arriving at the lab. She bypassed the entire concept of a formal greeting. She didn't acknowledge the council with a regal nod, or offer a ceremonial welcome to the off-world guest. Her eyes, a startling clear silver, went straight to Reeves and stayed there. The emotional aura radiating from her wasn't the expected formal purple of royal duty, or the warm gold of diplomatic welcome. It was a cool, focused teal, pure, undiluted curiosity. Her throne, which had sat empty, now glowed with the same sharp, analytical color. She was here to work, not to perform. Reeves felt the carefully memorized opening lines of his diplomatic address evaporate from his mind. His prepared speech about Earth's peaceful intentions and hopes for mutual prosperity felt suddenly ridiculous, a child's recitation in a room full of scholars. He'd braced for pageantry, for symbolic gestures and layers of protocol. He got a direct, appraising stare that felt like a full-body scan. She studied him the way a xenogeologist studies a fascinating, unknown rock formation, not as an opponent to be outmaneuvered, but as a puzzle to be understood. The lack of expected ceremony was more disarming than any show of force. The council chamber responded to her presence instantly. The scattered individual emotional colors of the elders, the indigo, the yellow sparks, the patient green, all began to shift, their hues sliding toward her focused teal. It was like watching paint colors mix toward a dominant shade. The room's ambient hum lowered, the crystalline tones becoming sharper, more precise. The collective mood of the leadership snapped into alignment with hers, intense, undistracted inquiry. The theatrical setting remained, but the play had been canceled. This was a diagnostic session. She took a step toward him, her movements economical. She didn't seem to notice the awe-inspiring grandeur of the chamber around them. Her attention was on the micro-expressions on his face, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were held. She was reading his nervous system, not his credentials. His ambassadorial title, his official portfolio, the sealed documents from Earth, none of it seemed to matter. She was more interested in the honest flicker of anxiety in his eyes than in any promise he might make on behalf of his planet. This was the polar opposite of every first contact briefing he'd ever endured. There was no posturing, no carefully weighed opening gambits. Just her presence, a quiet force that vacuumed all the diplomatic filler out of the room. It was terribly efficient and utterly unnerving. He realized he was holding his breath. The pressure to perform, to be the perfect diplomat, became unbearable under her silent, curious gaze. It felt childish, pointless. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping. The facade cracked and then crumbled. He stopped trying to look like an unflappable ambassador and just stood there, a slightly overwhelmed human being in a very strange place. The crystals at his feet, which had been broadcasting his nervous blue, softened into a more neutral, transparent shimmer. She gave a single, slight nod, as if this was the response she'd been waiting for. Her teal aura didn't change. It deepened, if anything, the curiosity now tinged with what might have been approval. She had bypassed the Royalty Act because she didn't need it. Her authority wasn't in a title or a ceremony. It was in her ability to strip away everything that wasn't real. The most royal thing she could do was to ignore the role entirely and just be the person the moment required. Princess Elenara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She simply raised a hand and the air above the council floor shimmered. A star chart appeared, crisp and cold. 3 points of light winked out. Then 2 more. Then an entire moon. They didn't flare or fracture. They just ceased. One moment they were there, part of the cosmic record. The next they were empty coordinates. No debris, no energy signature, no historical echo. It was as if they had been selected and edited out of reality itself. 3 mining stations, she said, her voice flat. 2 research outposts. 1 moon. Each location was a place where species had recently begun to cooperate. A joint venture between the Trell and the Cathar. A shared observatory run by 5 systems. The moon was a neutral diplomatic zone, hosting its first peace talks in a generation. The attacks weren't random. They were targeted with surgical, horrifying precision. They hit the idea of alliance at the moment of its birth. The Void Syndicate doesn't use bombs. They don't use radiation weapons or kinetic impactors. Their method is simpler and far worse. They unmake things. Their technology doesn't destroy matter. It severs an object's connection to space-time. It deletes its past, present, and future from the universal record. It's not an attack on a place. It's an attack on the fact that the place ever existed. There's nothing to fight, nothing to blockade, no enemy fleet to engage. You're not battling an army. You're arguing with a backspace key. This changes the nature of the conflict completely. Traditional warfare is useless. You can't shoot a concept. You can't armor-plate a treaty. A battlecruiser is as relevant against this threat as a stone axe. The Syndicate isn't trying to conquer territory or seize resources. Their goal seems to be the prevention of connection itself. They target the fragile early-stage agreements, the fledgling coalitions, the first handshake between old enemies. They are attacking the very possibility of cooperation. The pattern is clear. They don't want to rule the galaxy. They want to ensure the galaxy can never be united. They weaponize solitude. They enforce isolation. A new trade pact is signed. The signing venue vanishes. A mutual defense agreement is drafted. The system where it was written is erased. It's a strategy of existential nihilism. They aren't just killing people. They are killing the context those people built. They make collaboration synonymous with extinction. This left the Asterian Council with a problem that had no military solution. You can't deploy a fleet against an enemy that attacks ideas. You can't fortify a thought. The only possible defense is something equally conceptual. The threat requires presence. It requires a counterforce of pure, stubborn existence, a shared consciousness so rooted in the now that it can't be unmade, a bond that is itself a fact, as undeniable as gravity. Reeves looked from the star chart full of holes to the calm, resolved faces of the Council. Their emotional auras had solidified into a unified, grim cobalt. He finally understood why Earth's blunt force diplomacy had been so thoroughly dismissed. They weren't being asked to contribute soldiers or ships. They were being asked to contribute a state of mind, a way of being that was resilient not because it was strong but because it was real. The question hung in the crystalline air, heavy and unavoidable. How do you fight an enemy for whom your existence is just a draft waiting to be deleted? He was supposed to be thinking about void syndicates and existential threats. His mind was supposed to be full of strategic calculations and diplomatic phrasing. Instead, as he watched Princess Elenara explain the cold, precise nature of the enemy, his brain offered up a completely different, utterly unprofessional thought. It wasn't even a fully formed sentence. It was a primitive, emotional pulse of pure, stupid awe. I wish the most gorgeous princess I have ever seen would marry me. It was an internal monologue, a private, shameful little confession he'd never ever say out loud. It was supposed to stay locked inside his skull, his own secret humiliation. On Earth it would have. On Asteria the thought had weight. It had frequency. The crystal under his feet felt it first, a sudden warm vibration. Then the wall behind the princess, which had been a steady, analytical teal, flushed a deep, romantic violet. The light caught the facets, refracting the color across the entire chamber in swirling, rose-tinted patterns. His private wish was now a public light show. Every single council member turned. Their own emotional auras, a moment ago a unified field of grim cobalt, now flickered with new tones. Surprise, confusion, a ripple of bright orange curiosity. They weren't angry. They were attentive. They had all heard it. The architecture had translated his raw, unfiltered attraction into a universal broadcast. There was no taking it back. No claiming it was out of context. The evidence was painted across the ceiling in brilliant, embarrassed scarlet streaks that pulsed in time with his skyrocketing heart rate. Reeves felt the blood drain from his face. This was it. This was the Sigma Phi toast incident all over again, but 1,000 times worse. He hadn't just insulted a cultural norm. He had propositioned a royal during a security briefing about reality-eating terrorists. He braced for the fallout, for the cold dismissal, for Zephyr to quietly escort him back to his ship in disgrace. His career was over. Earth's best chance at an alliance was ruined because he couldn't keep his stupid, admiring thoughts to himself on a planet that literally read minds. Princess Elenara didn't look offended. Her sharp silver eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners. Her own teal aura, so focused and serious, now swirled with threads of bright, genuine gold. Amusement. Her lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile but was a long way from a frown. She studied the violet patterns on the wall for a moment, then turned that analytical gaze back to him. The room was utterly silent, waiting for the royal decree. "You heard correctly," she said, her voice clean and clear, cutting through the tension. It wasn't a condemnation. It was a simple statement of fact. She looked from the romantic lights back to his horrified expression. "And I find your honesty refreshing." The gold threads in her aura multiplied, shimmering. It wasn't the reaction of someone who felt insulted. It was the reaction of a scientist who'd just discovered a fascinating new data point. His catastrophic lack of filter was, to her, a feature. The council's collective mood shifted instantly. The surprise and confusion melted away, replaced by a low, thoughtful hum. Their auras softened into a spectrum of considering greens and contemplative purples. They weren't looking at a diplomatic failure. They were looking at a new variable. His monumental blunder hadn't caused a disaster. It had introduced a new piece of information into their calculations. The raw human honesty of it was a commodity they understood. It was real data. The scarlet of his embarrassment on the walls began to fade, blending with the thoughtful colors of the council into a softer, more complex pattern. The crisis had passed. In fact, it hadn't been a crisis at all. It had been a breakthrough. He had accidentally given them exactly what their entire culture valued most, an unvarnished, emotionally true signal. On a planet where every feeling was currency, he'd just dropped a gold brick on the negotiating table. His face was still hot, but the floor under his feet felt steady, solid. The wrong thing had turned out to be the only thing that could have worked. Princess Elenara didn't blush. She didn't simper or look away. She tilted her head, her silver eyes narrowing with the same focus she'd given the star chart moments before. The romantic violet light rippling across the chamber walls wasn't a signal of flattery to her. It was a data set. Your proposal presents an interesting variable, she stated, her voice devoid of any sentimental tone. We should treat it as a live compatibility test. The council's humming intensified. Their auras shifted from thoughtful purples into sharper, more analytical shades of blue and silver. They weren't debating the romantic implications of a human's impulsive wish. They were processing a new strategic input. On Asteria, a courtship proposal wasn't a question of the heart. It was an invitation to a deeply structured evaluation of cognitive and empathic alignment. This wasn't about love. It was about operational synergy. Reeves stood frozen, his own embarrassment fading into bewildered shock. He'd expected to be thrown out, not enrolled in a psychological exam. The council began a rapid, silent consultation, their emotional auras pulsing and merging in a complex, color-based debate. They were interpreting his blunder within their own intricate frameworks for alliance building. A political marriage, in their view, was a crude and useless tool. It bound bodies, not minds. What they valued was a proven compatibility of thought, a shared wavelength that could withstand pressure. Their culture had no use for ceremonial traditions or sentimental attachments. They valued psychological nuance. The strength of a bond was measured in its resilience under stress, its capacity for mutual problem-solving, its ability to produce a third, combined intelligence greater than the sum of its parts. Romance was considered a pleasant side effect, not a foundation. The real work was in the merging of perspectives. The trials they began to outline weren't tests of strength or clever puzzles. They were exercises in pure mutual understanding, a simulated crisis requiring a joint solution, a shared navigation of a memory lattice where one's fears became the other's obstacles, a dialogue where each had to accurately predict the other's emotional and logical response to a given threat. The goal was to see if two consciousnesses could function as a single, more effective unit. This approach was a direct refusal to reduce a vital interspecies alliance to the simple, transactional level of a political marriage. It was too important. The Void Syndicate threat demanded a connection far deeper than a signed treaty or a royal union. It required a fusion of human intuition and Asterian empathic precision at a fundamental level. They weren't looking for a diplomat's husband. They were calibrating a new kind of weapon against oblivion, one built from combined consciousness. David's human imperfections, which he saw as lifelong liabilities, were suddenly invaluable. His anxiety was a data point on stress response. His tendency to speak without filtering was a metric for authenticity. His messy, intuitive problem-solving style was a variable they couldn't simulate. His failures were not disqualifying. They were the most interesting part of his profile. They provided the friction points needed to test the potential bond's real-world durability. The resolution was taking shape not in a romantic context, but a strategic one. Their potential bond was being framed as a tactical asset. It strategically blended raw human emotion with refined Asterian intellect, creating a new model for cooperation. It was a partnership where feeling-informed strategy and intellect gave emotion direction. The council saw in his accidental proposal not a scandal, but a potential key, a way to forge an alliance that was both intellectually robust and emotionally true. The most political union they could conceive of was, paradoxically, the most personal one imaginable. It demanded total transparency, absolute psychological nakedness. It made the personal utterly political, and the political deeply unavoidably personal. The fate of two species might not rest on a treaty, but on whether two people could truly understand each other. Elenara led him into the garden, and the air changed. It tasted like cold mint and distant lightning. The paths weren't paved. They were living moss that shifted underfoot. adjusting its texture to match his pace. This was the palace's natural extension of their emotional architecture, but wilder, less controlled. A place where privacy and exposure were engineered by biology, not crystal. It was beautiful. It was also a trap, a flower the color of a fresh bruise tilted toward him as he passed. Its petals didn't release scent. They released a thought, a perfect projected image of his own confused face from moments before, superimposed over a diagram of conflicting neural pathways. The flower was analyzing his confusion, displaying its diagnosis for anyone to see. He took a step back. A cluster of silver roses turned their blooms toward him. They didn't have a scent either. They had a sound, a soft, chiming gossip like tiny bells discussing his social missteps in real time. They were comparing his emotional data to some unseen database, their petals trembling with the exchange. Privacy here was a shaped absence. Vines curled into dense, sound-dampening arches where two Asterians stood talking, their emotional auras contained within the green bubble. Other plants created zones of amplified clarity, projecting a speaker's feelings for all to witness. The garden wasn't a passive space. It was a dynamic instrument for social interaction, a blend of park and panopticon. You could have a secret meeting, but the flora would be recording the subtext. Elenara stopped beside a tree whose bark swirled with slow, liquid light. She didn't look at him. She watched a flower replay his anxious stumble from the amphitheater. "We have very thorough files on human negotiation tactics," she said. Her voice was calm, factual. "The posturing, the strategic delays, the false concessions. Our analysts were fascinated by your profile." It didn't fit. She finally turned her silver gaze on him. "Your anxiety ratings were off the charts. Your problem-solving scores, however, spiked under pressure. You don't negotiate. You improvise. That was the variable we couldn't simulate. His flaws weren't just known to them. They were the core of his dossier. His messiness was the interesting part. The garden was serving a dual purpose. It was a setting for a courtship trial, a traditionally intimate space. It was also a live intelligence-gathering operation, profiling his reactions in an uncontrolled environment. The roses gossiped. The trees recorded. The moss measured his stress levels through his footsteps. Romance and reconnaissance were the same activity here. Their culture didn't separate thought, feeling, and action. They wove them into a single social fabric. A walk in the garden was a psychological stress test. A conversation was a data-gathering mission. A courtship was the deepest form of strategic analysis. There was no such thing as a purely social interaction. Every moment was multitasking. Every beautiful flower a potential spy. He looked at Elenara, who was calmly watching a hovering insect that seemed to be sketching his biosignatures in the air with light. Her focus was absolute, clinical. This wasn't a date. It was a fieldwork observation. The resolution was as clear as the alien sunlight. What felt like the beginning of a personal connection was, for her, the collection of vital tactical data. The most beautiful, serene place in the palace was also the most dangerous. You let your guard down here. You thought you were being romantic. And the entire ecosystem was taking notes. Elenara led him down, deep below the crystalline council chamber. The air grew colder, smelling of static and old stone. The smooth living walls gave way to rough-hewn rock inscribed with angular glyphs that pulsed with a weak, dormant light. This wasn't part of the active palace. This was its forgotten foundation, its buried history. She stopped before a vast stone slab, its surface covered in text that swam and shifted like oil on water. "The oldest records we have," she said. "They're not stories. They're instructions." The fragments were partial, damaged. Phrases surfaced from the flowing script. "When star children walk in darkness and hope becomes legend." The words weren't poetic. They were conditional, a set of parameters. The sleepers beneath the throne await the paired key. It spoke of a defense mechanism, a system built into the planet's core, designed not to attack, but to preserve. To anchor reality, it had been dormant for millennia, its activation sequence lost to time, its purpose fading into myth. This wasn't a legend. It was a piece of forgotten engineering, a machine, biological and technological, woven into Asteria's very crust, waiting for a specific trigger. The prophecy wasn't predicting a future event. It was describing the required login credentials. The sleepers weren't mythical guardians. They were the system's inert core processors. They needed a specific kind of signal to wake up. A paired consciousness, Two minds, fundamentally different yet perfectly synchronized, acting as a single key. David's human mind, with its messy, intuitive leaps and deep-seated existential dread, was one half. Elenara's Asterian consciousness, a model of empathic precision and cool calculation, was the other. His unease wasn't a weakness here. It was a necessary component. Her calm wasn't just composure. It was the stabilizing frequency. Their union, this bizarre compatibility tested in the gardens and the council chamber, wasn't about romance or politics anymore. It might be the only thing that could throw the switch on a weapon older than their civilizations. The Void Syndicate crisis immediately reframed itself. This wasn't just a political or military problem. It was a spiritual and technological one. The enemy used weapons that deleted things from existence. Asteria's ancient defense mechanism was designed to do the opposite, to make reality so stubborn, so deeply anchored in memory and shared consciousness, that it couldn't be erased. The fight wasn't about destroying the Syndicate. It was about making their targets impossible to delete. The prophecy laid out a plan that was terrifyingly relevant. It wasn't about finding a battle fleet. It was about finding the right two people. Diplomacy stopped being about negotiation. It became a literal act of planetary self-defense. The alliance between Earth and Asteria was no longer a matter of trade agreements or mutual protection pacts. It was about providing the specific key, the paired consciousness required to activate their world's ultimate shield. Their success wouldn't be measured in treaties signed, but in a planetary-scale system roaring to life after 1,000,000 years of silence. The personal had become geological. The oldest stories weren't just relevant, they were the operational manuals. The solution to a hyper-advanced threat was buried in the most ancient part of their history. It suggested that the builders of this system had foreseen a time when cooperation wouldn't be a choice, but a requirement for survival. They hadn't left behind a weapon, they'd left behind a lock, and they'd written the combination in a language everyone had forgotten how to read, until a nervous human and a pragmatic princess stumbled upon it. Sometimes the most advanced defense is the one that was already there, waiting for the right moment to remember itself. The Nexus didn't look like a console, it looked like a shared nightmare. Two crystalline thrones faced each other in the center of the chamber, connected by a crackling arc of energy that smelled of ozone and cold stone. There were no buttons, no screens, no control panels, just the two seats and the empty space between them, humming with potential. This was the interface. It didn't require a pilot, it required a partnership. The activation wasn't a procedure. It was a fusion. Two consciousnesses had to merge, not fully, but enough to create a third combined mind. One for navigation, one for stabilization. David's job was intuitive leaps. The messy, creative problem-solving that made no logical sense but sometimes worked. Elenara's was empathic calibration, the precise emotional tuning needed to keep their merged state from tearing itself apart. His mind was the engine. Hers was the gyroscope. Separately, they were useless. Combined, they might be a key. This wasn't about skill. It was about trust. Profound, terrifying interdependence. They weren't pushing buttons or entering codes. They were opening their minds to each other, letting their thoughts and feelings bleed together in the space between the thrones. The system didn't care about technical knowledge or firepower. It measured the strength of a bond. It needed a connection so solid that two people could share a single thought without losing themselves. Their earlier compatibility tests in the garden, the council chamber, the emotional lock, those were just rehearsals. Theory. This was the terrifyingly practical application. The stakes were no longer diplomatic points or a political alliance. The readout floating above the thrones showed the Void Syndicate's next projected target, a sector holding 17 fledgling trade colonies. 1,000,000 lives. Failure here meant more than embarrassment. It meant watching a chunk of the galaxy and everyone in it get edited out of existence. There was no plan B. The interface pulsed, waiting. It didn't respond to practice technique or perfect execution. It responded to emotional authenticity, to the raw, unfiltered truth of who they were together. If they tried to perform the bond, to fake the connection, the energy arc would flicker and die. The system would reject them. Perfection was the one thing it couldn't accept. It needed their flaws, their doubts, their real unpolished selves. David looked at Elenara. Her usual analytical calm was there, but beneath it he could feel a thread of the same cold fear that was icing his own veins. They were both afraid. They were both out of their depth. That was the point. Their only hope was to lean into that, to be ridiculously stubbornly real with each other, to stop trying to be the perfect ambassador and the flawless princess and just be two terrified people who had to make this work. He let his guard down. He let her feel the full panicked rush of his thoughts, the dread of failure, the stupid, persistent hope. She didn't recoil. She met it with her own focused resolve. Her calculated risk assessment, her quiet determination, their minds didn't clash. They braided. His chaos wrapped around her order. Her precision gave his intuition direction. The energy arc between the thrones flared, not with a violent burst but with a steady, growing light. It wasn't a perfect fusion. It was a messy, beautiful, effective one. The most advanced piece of technology in the known galaxy, a machine built to defend reality itself, didn't need a genius or a soldier to operate it. It needed a human connection. It needed the one thing that was both utterly simple and impossibly complex. It needed two people to choose to be real with each other, even when being real was the hardest thing in the world. The system hummed, accepting them. The interface flared to life. The moment their minds touched the nexus, the planet woke up. It wasn't a sound or a light. It was a presence vast and ancient. Settling around them like a blanket of sentient stone, it noticed them. A thought formed in the space between David and Elenara, not in words but in pure concepts. It felt like geological patience and gentle, deep amusement. The planetary consciousness had been waiting a long time. It was pleased they'd finally figured out the password. This wasn't a tactical update. The consciousness poured understanding into their merged minds, and the scale of the crisis suddenly yawned wide open. The Void Syndicate wasn't just attacking places. It was attacking the idea of places. Its weapons targeted the memory of a thing in the universal record, unraveling its history until it never was. This was an existential war, a fight over what gets to be real and what gets forgotten. The defense mechanism they'd activated wasn't a shield or a cannon. It was an anchor, a system designed to preserve memory against erasure itself. It made facts sticky. It made history heavy. Their connection was the spark, but the universe itself seemed to answer. It was a stubborn, fundamental insistence on reality, on the right of things to exist, to have existed. The Nexus fed them data. 3 moons in a distant system winked out under a syndicate attack. Standard procedure. But this time they flickered. The Void tried to delete them, but something pushed back. The memory of those moons, their place in the cosmos, their gravitational signature on nearby asteroids, it all held firm. The deletion failed. The moons snapped back into existence, shuddering but intact. The anchor had held. The nature of the battle shifted completely. It was no longer about destruction. It was about epistemic defense, a fight for the integrity of information, for the persistence of memory. The Syndicate used weapons that exploited entropy, that encouraged the universe to forget. Asteria's ancient system fought back by making reality remember. It reinforced the cosmic narrative, making it too robust to edit. Reality itself became the countermeasure. Their joined consciousness wasn't directing a weapon. They were tending a garden of facts, watering the roots of what was true so it couldn't be pulled up. Victory wasn't measured in enemy ships destroyed. It was measured in things that continued to exist. A trade pact that wasn't erased from the signatories' minds, a star system that remained on the charts, a colony that kept its history. The fight became a quiet, relentless act of stubbornness, of remembrance. The planetary consciousness worked through them, a vast intelligence using their bond as a focal point to push back against the nothingness. It was a deeply passive-aggressive form of warfare. The enemy tried to delete. Asteria simply refused to forget. The resolution was both humbling and immense. Meaningful resistance wasn't about outgunning the enemy. It was about outpacing entropy. It was about community, connection, and shared memory being stronger than any weapon designed to enforce solitude. A story told by enough people becomes a fact. A bond felt by 2 species becomes a historical event. And a historical event properly anchored is a very difficult thing to make disappear. The Syndicate's greatest weakness wasn't a vulnerability in their ships. It was the sheer stubborn weight of a universe that had decided it liked existing. Sometimes the most powerful way to fight is to simply, stubbornly remember what you're fighting for, to hold on to the memory of light so tightly that the darkness can't pry your fingers open. The battle wasn't happening in space. It was happening in the history books. and for the first time the good guys were winning. The moment their minds connected within the nexus, the hum of the machine vanished, not into silence but into a presence. A vast, quiet awareness settled around them, ancient and patient. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a gentle, amused recognition, like a mountain recognizing two ants who'd finally found the right path. The planetary consciousness knew them. It had been waiting. It greeted them not with a fanfare but with a sense of deep geological welcome. The system was online. This was more than a defense mechanism. It was a memory. The consciousness showed them the crisis not as a tactical map, but as an epistemic wound. The Void Syndicate weren't just destroying targets. They were unraveling the fabric of shared existence, snipping threads from the tapestry of known reality. Each erased station, each vanished moon, was a hole in the universe's memory. The battle wasn't for territory. It was for remembrance. The Asterian system didn't fight back with force. It fought back with fact. It made reality itself too stubborn, too deeply recorded to be simply deleted. The 3 moons targeted next by the Syndicate flickered on the display. Their light began to dim, the Syndicate's unmaking process starting its silent work. But then something happened. The moons didn't vanish. They stuttered. Their image blurred, then sharpened. The planetary consciousness, anchored by the combined mind of David and Eleonora, was pushing back. It wasn't blocking an attack. It was insisting on existence. It was reminding the universe that these moons were there, that they had mass and history, and a place in the celestial order. The erasure process hit a wall of pure, stubborn isness. Victory didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like a sustained note, a defiant act of continued being. There was no glorious blast, no triumphant surge. The Syndicate's weapon simply stopped working. It couldn't complete the deletion because the thing it was trying to delete was now anchored by a planetary-scale consciousness that refused to forget. The conflict shifted from a battle of destruction to a battle of persistence. The universe itself seemed to lean into their defense, the natural laws reinforcing their claim on existence. Their authenticity was the core of the weapon. David's chaotic, intuitive understanding of problems and Eleonora's precise empathic calibration created a feedback loop the system could use. His leaps of logic provided unexpected solutions. Her control kept their merged state stable under the immense pressure. Their real, unvarnished connection, flaws and all, was the only thing strong enough to power the Matrix. A perfect performed partnership would have shattered. Their messy, real one held. The defense didn't end when the immediate threat passed. Their bond had permanently activated the system. The Harmony Matrix wasn't a temporary shield. It was a new layer of reality, a perpetual assertion of being that now emanated from Asteria's core. It was a standing declaration that some things were too real to be unmade. The alliance between their species was now literally woven into the planet's operational systems. It was the lock and they were the living key, this redefined cooperation. They hadn't built a fleet together or signed a mutual aggression pact. They had achieved a cognitive and empathic alignment so complete it could power a planet's defenses. It was a new model, one based not on shared interest but on shared consciousness. It proved that the most powerful alliances aren't built on contracts but on a genuine ability to understand another mind. The resolution was clear. You can't always protect what you love with violence. Sometimes protection is an act of creative resistance. It's making a garden so vibrant it can't be paved, a story so compelling it can't be silenced, a bond so real it can't be broken. The Harmony Matrix didn't win a war. It won an argument. It argued with nothingness itself, and it won by being more interesting, more complex, and more stubbornly present. It proved that in the face of absolute negation, the most revolutionary thing you can do is to be completely, unapologetically real. Being genuine ceased to be a personal choice and became a strategic one. 6 months later, the same crystalline amphitheater was almost unrecognizable. The air still hummed with power, but the tension had bled out of it, replaced by a steady, confident warmth. The alliance ceremony was underway, but it bore no resemblance to the stiff, formal event Earth's diplomatic corps had drafted. There were no long speeches, no exchange of scrolls. Ambassador Reeves stood beside Princess Eleonora, and the hall itself did most of the talking. The resonant crystals around them glowed with a complex interwoven pattern of cool human blue and steady Asterian teal. It wasn't just a display. It was a statement. The relationship was already operational. The ceremony was just making it official. The setup was the same grand spectacle, but the context had transformed. The hall wasn't a chamber of judgment anymore. It was a witness to a proven concept. The crystals, which had once amplified every flicker of anxiety into a public crisis, now showed a stable, merged field of purpose. You could feel the difference. The air didn't feel heavy with scrutiny. It felt charged with potential. The formalities were short, almost an afterthought. The real work had already been done in the Nexus, in the gardens, in the months of building a working partnership. This was just the receipt. Back on Earth, the diplomatic corps was scrambling. Their entire playbook was obsolete. Protocols built over centuries for managing first contacts and alliances were suddenly useless. A team of junior analysts who had studied the initial reports from Asteria were now leading retraining seminars. Their subject, how to stop performing and start connecting. How to use your weaknesses as entry points. The old guard argued, of course. They called it reckless. They called it emotional. But you can't argue with results. You can't dismiss a defense system that stopped an existential threat cold. Earth's approach had to evolve, forced to grow beyond its rigid, fearful protocols into something more fluid, more human. The bond between Reeves and Elenara became the new model. It wasn't held up as a romantic ideal. It was studied as a strategic blueprint, a case study in how radical transparency could create resilience. Human flaws were reevaluated. Anxiety wasn't a liability to be hidden. It was a data point on stress response. A tendency to speak without a filter wasn't unprofessional. It was a source of unfakeable data. Humanity learned, to its great surprise, that its perceived weaknesses could be the very things that catalyzed extraordinary outcomes. Perfection was a brittle shield. Authenticity was armor. News of the victory spread, and so did the method. Other species, facing their own isolated struggles or wary of the Void Syndicate's return, began sending envoys. They didn't come asking for military pacts. They came asking for partnership models. They wanted to know how to build a bond like the one between a nervous human and a pragmatic princess. The Asterian embassy on Earth became the busiest diplomatic post on the planet, fielding requests for joint cognitive compatibility programs. Alliances were no longer just about shared resources or border agreements. They were about psychological alignment. The harmony matrix remained active, a perpetual silent reminder in the bedrock of the planet. Its steady hum was the new background noise of their alliance. It was the ultimate proof of concept. A thing built not from treaties but from trust. It meant the victory wasn't a one-time event. It was a permanent change in their reality. Diplomacy itself was redefined. It became less about flawless execution of a pre-written script, and more about the quality of the connection formed in the moment. Success was measured in the depth of understanding, not the number of clauses in an agreement. The goal shifted from not making mistakes to building something real enough to last. The resolution was clear. Those fragile, awkward beginnings, the orange panic at the arrival arch, the bungled proposal in the council chamber, hadn't been setbacks. They were the necessary friction that created a stronger bond. They gave way to alliances that weren't just politically resilient, but creatively so. They could adapt, improvise, and withstand pressure because they were built on truth, not technique. The old way was to follow the protocol exactly. The new way was to understand that sometimes the best protocol is to throw the protocol out the airlock and just talk to the person in front of you. Back on Earth, the diplomatic corps found its entire training model flipped upside down. New envoys preparing for postings to allied Asterian systems weren't drilled in protocol and posture. They were put through emotional calibration exercises. The goal wasn't to hide nerves. It was to project stable, readable anxiety. A trainee who could present their genuine unease without letting it spike into panic was considered top of the class. The old guard called it a circus. The new instructors called it progress. Traditional diplomatic training proved brutally inadequate. Veterans of 100 treaty negotiations found themselves floundering on Asteria. Their polished speeches made the walls turn a dull, uninterested gray. Their careful composure read as dishonesty. A veteran ambassador from the Martian colonies, famous for his unflappable demeanor, nearly caused an incident when his complete lack of visible stress was interpreted as profound contempt. He had to be pulled from the field. His replacement was a junior analyst with a documented anxiety disorder and a habit of speaking her mind. She succeeded immediately. The skill set changed overnight. The ability to be authentically imperfect became a valued, quantifiable skill. Recruiters started screening for emotional candor, not unflappable calm. Psychological profiles that once would have disqualified a candidate were now highlighted as assets. A diplomat's value was measured in their readable transparency. Earth's greatest weakness, its messy, unfiltered humanity, had become its most valuable export. It was the one thing other species couldn't easily replicate, and the Asterians prized above all else. This shift in approach was soon augmented with technology. Asterian bioadaptive systems began integrating quietly into human diplomatic missions. Walls and embassies on neutral worlds were subtly enhanced to display emotional feedback. Translation software was updated to convey tone and subtext, not just words. Human diplomats, once flying blind, now had a real-time readout of their own emotional impact. It was like giving a pilot instruments for social weather. They could see when their frustration was causing a room to tense, or when their genuine curiosity was opening doors. It was a massive unfair advantage. The galaxy took notice. Watch the species that built empires on secrecy and misdirection. The Vex, the Silent Guild, the Cathar Shadow Cabal. They had to adapt or become obsolete. Their entire strategic doctrine was built on controlling information and hiding intent. Against a partner species that valued radical transparency, their methods were useless. They couldn't negotiate with someone who could literally see their duplicity painted on the walls. They either had to learn a new way of operating or get left out of the new alliances forming. The economic and political power was shifting toward those who could be real. This created a new galactic economy of trust. Vulnerability, once the ultimate liability in statecraft, became the foundation. Deals weren't brokered in secret backrooms with layered contingencies. They were made in open chambers where everyone's emotional state was part of the record. It was inefficient. It was messy. It was also incredibly resilient. An agreement made this way was built on a clear understanding of mutual interest and genuine intent. There were fewer surprises, fewer betrayals. The resolution was counterintuitive to centuries of political theory. Sometimes showing your entire hand is a better strategy than holding the best cards. When everyone can see your doubts and your hopes, your fears and your resolve, it creates a bond that a perfect poker face never could. It turns negotiation from a game of bluff into a shared project. The strongest alliances weren't built on the strongest secrets. They were built on the strongest truths. Humanity's accidental discovery that its flaws could be its greatest strength rewrote the rules for everyone. The new currency wasn't information. It was integrity. The entire story boils down to a single radical idea. Real connection is the biggest risk you can take. It throws out centuries of diplomatic playbooks that prioritized control and performance. The prophecy, the trials, the living city, the planetary defense, they all pointed to the same thing. Success wasn't in following the rules. It was in breaking them honestly. That doesn't mean everyone liked it. Traditionalists back on Earth and in other rigid empires argued fiercely for a return to strict protocols. They called the new methods emotional, reckless, a dangerous slide into subjectivity. They wanted the old certainty of sealed agreements and measured words. They saw vulnerability as a crack in the armor, not a window to a better room. The debate got loud, but it was hard to argue with a defense system that had literally reshaped local reality. Results have a way of silencing theory. At its core, it proved that companionship, romantic, strategic, or just deeply shared purpose, acts as a catalyst for resilience on a scale we never imagined. It isn't about sentimental feelings. It's about combined cognitive strength. Two minds, fully present and authentically engaged, create a third entity that is tougher and more creative than the sum of its parts. This combined presence becomes a fact the universe itself seems to recognize and support. It's less like building a wall and more like becoming a mountain. You can't delete a mountain. The universe, in its own strange way, rewarded that choice. It rewarded real over perfect. David's spectacular mistake, the marriage proposal broadcast to the entire council, became a galactic teaching moment. Study groups on a dozen worlds now analyze the emotional frequency patterns from that day. They don't see a blunder. They see the precise moment a human prioritized raw honesty over polished performance, and how the environment around him shifted from judgment to acceptance. His greatest professional embarrassment is now a foundational text in interspecies relations. Their partnership didn't just save a few planets. It echoed. It created a hunger. Other species, tired of the same old diplomatic dances, started looking for similar connections. The flawed but real model became the new standard because it worked better. It built alliances that could bend instead of break. Future agreements would likely follow this pattern, seeking psychological compatibility first and political terms second. The goal shifted from a perfect signature on a document to a real handshake that meant something. The resolution is simple, if terrifying. Sometimes the universe doesn't need a hero or a genius. It needs people who are willing to stand there and argue with impossibility itself. It needs people who will choose to be real, even when being real is the most difficult and embarrassing option available. The most impossible things, like stopping a weapon that erases reality, become possible the moment you stop pretending you have all the answers and just show up as you are. You trade the armor of perfection for the stronger shield of authenticity, and suddenly the unfightable enemy finds it has nothing to push against. The final image isn't of a throne room or a victory parade. It's a simple observation deck on a diplomatic cruiser, the starfield stretching out like a frozen spill of salt. Elenara and David stand side by side, not touching, but their postures mirror each other. They aren't celebrating. They're looking at the next problem. A disputed sector. A resource negotiation with a species that communicates in chemical clouds. Their partnership has become a fixed point, a beacon others are starting to navigate by. It's less a romance and more an ongoing experiment in collaborative thought. This is where the sci-fi part bleeds into the real. Their story isn't just an event. It's a template. It blends the speculative tech of a living world with the raw, unedited mess of human emotion and the precise rhythms of alien culture. It suggests that the future isn't about cleaner tech or bigger guns. It's about weirder, deeper connections. They demonstrate in a very practical way that emotional stakes aren't a distraction from strategy. They are the strategy. Their willingness to be embarrassed, to be wrong, to be genuinely confused, became their greatest tactical advantage against an enemy that calculated everything. Their continued existence is an argument, a living proof that perfection is a useless goal, that a cracked foundation can sometimes hold more weight than a flawless one. David's nervous habits, his tendency to speak before he thinks, his allergy to formal procedure, these aren't flaws they've cured. They're tools they've learned to use. Elenara's clinical analysis, her sometimes brutal honesty, her inability to perform social niceties, these aren't coldnesses to be warmed. They are precision instruments. Together, their imperfections interlock. They fit. Their journey doesn't end. It just changes scale. The political complexity is still there. The personal friction remains. They still argue. He still gets flustered. She still sometimes misses a joke. But now it all happens within a framework that values those moments as data, not failure. Every misstep is another point on the graph of their collaboration. They've become a single durable instrument, calibrated for handling the impossible, and the galaxy has taken notice. Other systems, other species watch them work. They see the results. A hunger starts to grow, a desire for that kind of realignment. Not just treaties, but fusion. The old models of cooperation, the pacts, the alliances, the non-aggression agreements begin to feel thin, unsatisfying, like talking about food instead of eating. The resolution of their story isn't a conclusion. It's an invitation. It makes the galaxy hungry for a new way to be together. It suggests that the future, for those willing to reach for it, belongs not to the most powerful or the most perfect, but to those brave enough to be embarrassingly, complicatedly, authentically human. And to those smart enough to partner with them. Effective diplomacy doesn't come from flawless scripts. It grows from the cracks in our composure. The universe has a way of rewarding those bold enough to be real, even when being real means making a spectacular mistake in front of everyone. What seems like a career-ending blunder can become the key that unlocks an alliance. It forces a question worth considering. Next time you feel the pressure to perform, to hide your uncertainty. What impossible thing might you actually achieve if you just stopped pretending and let your honest self show up?